Okay, so welcome everyone. This is supporting the mission and supporting the astronaut. And the longer title is How Communication Between Crew in Space and Mission Control on Earth Combines Operational Efficiency with Kindness and Subtle Humor. Yeah. And my goals today, so I have two goals with this 1 hour we have together. The first is to give you a better understanding of how communication between astronauts in space and mission controllers on Earth actually works. I mean, some of you may know this really well already, but for others, that's sort of my first purpose, to give you an idea about how does this actually work. And the second one is for you to gain some insight into how we can, again, combine operational efficiency with kindness and with this subtle humor in communication. And so this can both be if you are an actual astronaut or if you're a flight controller, or, because most of us do have Earthbound jobs. This is, I'm also trying to target the rest of us in that sense. And we have an hour in total, and I hope I'll have time at the end for questions. That's at least what I've planned for. Yes. So who's talking? Who am I? So my name is Dennis Jim Fredrickson, and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Communication and Psychology at Aalborg University in Denmark. I come from a communication background. That's where I have my master's degree from in 2009. I have a PhD that's now 3 years old. And I work at Aalborg University, and I've done that since 2010. And I'm doing research and teaching there. And broadly, so some of it is space-based, but broadly, it's somewhere in the cross-section between interpersonal communication, so communication between people, usually face-to-face, but not in the case of space, actually. But so that type of human connection and how we actually communicate and deal with each other. And that always considered in terms of what kind of relationships, what kind of organizations, what kind of contexts does this happen in? And space travel, human spaceflight is one very particular context for this area. But that's broadly what I'm working with. So that's me. I'm also quite curious. I think especially coming from a communication background, it was difficult for me to figure out who's my target audience here, who actually attends this type of event. So I hope you'll help me to get just a little bit acquainted. So if you want to, please write in the chat. So one is, where are you in the world right now? And secondly, is there a particular role you have that brought you here? So are you a student, or you're a space professional, a space enthusiast? Are you just curious, or what could it be? Just to give me an idea about who we are, that would be helpful. And also just help my curiosity, quite honestly. So thank you. Yes, so that's those are the opening words, and that brings us to this background area. And for some of you, this is going to be, I think, common knowledge, but I wanted to make sure that we were just on the same page for some of the basics. So the type of space-to-ground communication, the type of communication between astronauts and people on the ground that I'm working with and I'm doing research on is between ISS, the International Space Station, and people on the ground that are helping that. So I just want to give you the quick intro to that in case you don't know, or in case we have different ideas about what we're talking about. So this is the ISS, the International Space Station. It's flying around Earth right now. And astronauts will usually live around 6 months at a time up there and work up there. We've had astronauts on board the ISS since year 2000. So that actually means that for 22 years and a bit more soon, we've actually had uninterrupted human presence in space. I always find that a bit fascinating. Another sort of practical fact, if you will, is that it's flying around only 400 kilometers over the surface of Earth, so it's not that far away, and it's going at a 28,000 kilometers an hour. And one final sort of practical thing is that you can actually see it in the sky at night. And if you've never tried this, I can really recommend it. It looks like a really fast-moving star, but you can see it, and you can stand down here on Earth and actually know that, okay, there are human beings flying out there that we've put out there, and they're able to live and work in that tiny shiny dot. I always find that really fascinating. So that's the ISS. And if we're moving a bit closer into what I'm going to talk about, the ISS is in many ways an extremely complicated piece of machinery, and it's flying in a really dangerous environment. And I think what was surprising to me, actually, moving in from just being interested in space and then to digging my way further into it, was that astronauts aren't really experts in many of the onboard systems on board the space station. So they really rely on a really large group of experts that are on the ground. Usually these are called flight controllers. Some astronauts even refer to themselves as glorified lab technicians or glorified maintenance workers. I think so. It's a joke in one sense, but I think it also holds some truth in the sense that they have to call the ground to ask if something is not working, because there are subject matter experts down there that do the heavy lifting in terms of figuring out what the problem is and then help them solve it. So that's sort of a basis for having space to ground communication. And one of the places this takes place, I'm just going to move myself, is here. This is a picture from Mission Control at NASA at Houston. There are several of these mission control centers around the globe because different space agencies are involved with the ISS. And what you can see here are different desks, different areas. So these people all have a different part of maintaining the station and the systems on the station that they are in charge of. And that means if an astronaut has a problem, they can call the ground, and then it's someone's job in this room or in another room to find the answer and figure out what the problem is and fix it. Specifically for space-to-ground communication, there's one person in this room, it's called the Capcom at NASA, but it's the spacecraft communicator. So there's one person who has the job of actually verbally communicating with the astronaut. In this case, it's the person over here, but that's the one we're looking at. So when we're talking about space-to-ground communication, this is the person that the astronauts are actually talking to. And another schematic here. So that means I'm just going to go over here. Let's see. All right. So over here, we have the International Space Station. We have astronauts on board the International Space Station. And so if we go like this, what I'm talking about with space-to-ground communication is these people talking together. As one part of mission control, there's a spacecraft communicator, and on board ISS, there are astronauts. So that's your big picture of the situation we're dealing with here. Now, as I said before, so the ISS is this really extremely complicated piece of machinery, and it is flying in this really dangerous environment. And at the same time, it's really expensive to operate the ISS. And for many reasons, that also means that astronaut time is a pretty scarce resource. So it's one priority for running the ISS is to be really efficient in solving problems and to get tasks completed really efficiently and really quickly. And that has implications for the communication, or for how communication happens between the ground and between the astronauts up there. So one ideal for space-to-ground communication is to be, as I've put up here, clear, specific, and efficient. So it has to be quite clear what we're talking about, because it's a very complex place they're working, and they have to spend their time quite efficiently, basically. And I tried to make an example here. So if you can imagine that you're an astronaut working on this express rack here, that's part of the ISS. What you cannot do, this is of course a bit simplified perhaps, but you can't do, so am I supposed to move that red 2B-like thingy down to one of those connectors down there at the bottom right of this thing? That could cause problems because there are a lot of tubes here and a lot of connectors. So instead, a typical way for sort of the operational side of space-to-ground communication to work is that they'll say something like this. So they'll refer to a written procedure they have in front of them. In step 2.6 of the proxy procedure, please confirm that the expected serial number for the connector I'm moving is 1035, and that the location it's going to is, and so on and so on. So it's a very specific form of communication where you use a specific term. If you're talking about a connector, about a tube, that tube is going to have a number, and you're going to use that number. And if you're talking about a written procedure you're following, you're going to be specific about where am I in the procedure? What is it I'm reading right now? And that all, I mean, that has to do with safety, but it also has to do with efficiency and actually getting things done in an orderly and timely manner, if you will. One final way of explaining that is I tried explaining it like this to my colleagues, that you can consider space-to-ground communication. So it has to be really clear, precise, and efficient, like really high-level IT support, where they're just really quick about getting the problem solved, and they're really specific in what you need to do to get it fixed. So it gets the job done in that sense. But if you go back to my title for the talk, so the title was Supporting the Mission and Supporting the Astronaut. So supporting the mission, that's one way this is done, by training astronauts and spacecraft communicators to be clear, precise, efficient, and so on. But there's a second title here, second part of the title, and that is supporting the astronaut. So what about this second part then? That's where I'd like to go with my presentation, to also address that part of it. And to do that, I want to talk just a little bit about communication theory. It's a fairly standard model that some of you might be familiar with. A model of communication that makes the distinction between the content of communication and the content dimension and the relational dimension of communication. So we'll do it a bit step by step. So over here, just gonna go over here, you have two people talking, person A, person B. They're having a conversation. And when they're talking, when they're communicating, they're talking about something. So up here, you see there's a subject. They're talking about something. But at the same time, there's an interpersonal relation between them. So these people in the astronaut panel, one of the astronauts was talking about perspectives and about that how we can have different perspectives on things as human beings. And so that is here, that's the subject relation. So the person's perspective on the subject they're talking about. But at the same time, whenever we have a conversation right now, so this is a very one-sided conversation. I'm at least doing most of the verbal talking here, but it actually takes place in an interpersonal relationship between us. There are words here. Yeah, and that model has implications for talking about space-to-ground communication. So if we move on a bit, yeah, so it's the same here. These two are having a conversation about something, and there's a certain relationship between them. We could argue here, we could guess that it's a warm, caring relationship, perhaps, just based on what we're seeing, and that could have implications for the way they talk about what they're talking about, and also the other way around, that the way we talk about things also has implications for what kind of relationship we have with other people. Yeah, same here, different people, but this is the same model, the same basic idea. So if we translate that into, again, I have to move, space-to-ground communication, same model as before. Yes, the same will happen here. And then we can add the aspects we had from before. So if we're talking about the subject, we have this ideal of being clear, being concise, and being operationally relevant. That's another way of saying what I was addressing before. But there's also a relational aspect to be considered. So if you were here for Anahita's talk, one of the things you were talking about, Anahita, was also about the need for feeling human connection, the need for things that don't only not only have to do with getting the job done or surviving, but I mean living in a sense. And one of those things that we can also do through communication is support astronauts' well-being, and also support the working relationship between crew and mission control on the ground, so that keeps being useful. And so, for instance, and that's what I've studied in my research on space-to-ground communication, what happens down here in this interpersonal relational area is that humor and kindness and warmth and this feeling of human connection, is also part of space-to-ground communication, in addition to being really specific and trying to be quite efficient as well. So, and one of the questions that I have then, that I'll now share with you is, so, okay, if we have these ideals of being really clear, really specific, and really efficient, couldn't that also come at the cost of feeling kindness, of feeling warmth, of feeling that human connection that we also need as human beings? And another way of saying that is that, so if we have the operational ideals over here of being clear, of being specific, of being efficient, what if we, I mean, there could be a backside of that coin. So clear communication could run the risk of being sterile. Specific communication could run the risk of being rigidly kept as short as humanly possible, because I need to get things moving. And if you're communicating solely with the purpose of being really efficient, it could also run the risk of turning almost cold. And you can play around with that and, you know, use other words, but I thought that was a nice, it sort of shows the potential backside of following those ideals if you're only following them. And that brings us to this point. So for astronauts, for flight controllers, for the people on the ground that are communicating with the astronauts, there could be a problem here, potentially on paper, but there doesn't seem to be a problem here, interestingly, from what I found when I was studying this. So what I've done is I've looked at how what's it called? I've transcribed a lot of the actual radio communication that goes on between English-speaking astronauts on the ISS and English-speaking flight controllers on the ground. I don't speak Russian, so that was sort of my stopgap there. And what I found was that astronauts and spacecraft communicators, they even quite elegantly combine this operational efficiency with kindness and with subtle humor. What I've tried to do, and there are references at the end of the slides, is to develop a terminology to describe this. So I'm talking about operational wit, or being witty. So they have subtle humor and other sort of imaginative uses of language built into this otherwise operational communication. And I also found what I've called operational kindness. So they're combining, again, being operational, being efficient and clear, with being helpful, with showing appreciation, with showing an understanding of other people's perspectives. And so there's a quite nice balance there that I'm going to try to show you how, at least one example of how they're doing. And that example comes here. So, and this is where things might get a little technical. I'm going to show you a transcription, and then I'm going to try to do just a little bit of actual conversation analysis live with you guys to give you an idea about, in some detail, what it is that I found that they were doing. So let's have a look. First, I'm just going to read out loud what happens in this little interaction. This is Chris. He's an astronaut on board the ISS, and Allison is sitting in mission control in Houston. So I'm just going to run through it first and tell you what they're saying, read it out loud, and then afterwards, I'll say a little bit more about it. So this starts by Chris saying, "Houston, station on 2 for SSC 22. That's how he starts. Allison responds, "Go for SSC 22. So she's saying she's ready to listen now. So Chris says, "Good morning, Allison," or "Good afternoon," "Good morning. I know that you guys have probably got handover from the last shift that we were having issues with SSC 22. SSC 22 is a laptop. It's a computer. And since then, we've done a reboot, and a reboot with a battery removal, and a reboot with a battery removal, and a hard drive removal, and I have logged back in. It's still giving us the same issues. I just want to give you the update that we've done those additional steps. You're welcome to come on board at any time. I know that Pluto is working on a lot of things this morning. And Pluto isn't a person. That's the name of one of the positions, one of the areas of expertise in mission control. So that's what Chris says. Allison in mission control replies, Thanks, Chris. It's good to talk to you. We appreciate the update, and Pluto is definitely working on a lot of things and has put that on their to-do list. Chris answers, okay, copy. I just wanted to let them know that we've done those additional steps of the different, all the reboots that we're capable of doing. So just wanted to add that. So take the time. We appreciate all the hard work on the weekend. Allison finally replies, and we appreciate your troubleshooting as well. Thanks, Chris. So that's the conversation. And from the observation data I have, it's quite typical of what we're seeing in space-to-ground communication. So if we now sort of dive into this conversation, I'm going to try and give you a little analytical insight into where I'm finding operational kindness, where I'm finding that it's not just operational, but it's also relationally kind, yeah, for lack of a better word. So the first thing, we see here that Chris is using Allison's first name without her having identified herself. So Allison just says, go for SSC 22. And then Chris says, good morning, Allison. So he's demonstrating familiarity. He's actually showing that he knows her well enough to greet her by her first name without her actually having identified herself, because they can't see each other. So likely he's able to recognize her by voice alone. Secondly, Chris greets her, and I put finally here because he's changing his mind a bit back and forth, with good morning. So he's going, good morning, Allison, or good afternoon, good morning. And I think that's a little gesture in that he's showing that he knows what the time is where she's placed in Houston, because that's actually 5 hours behind the time zone that they're keeping on the ISS. So I think what's happening is that he's doing the math in his head up here, figuring out, okay, what must the time be where you're at right now? And in that sense, and it's a tiny gesture, but he's showing an understanding of a little aspect of Allison's situation in that sense. Next, Chris says, I know that you guys have probably got handover from the last shift. So he's demonstrating that he understands how mission control does handovers between shifts. So he's showing an understanding. He's showing an understanding of a different perspective than one he has here of how things are actually work in mission control. And then a little further down, Chris said, I know that Pluto is working on a lot of things this morning. And also here, he's demonstrating an understanding of the working conditions of people in mission control. So he understands if this is going to take a while, basically. And he's even at the bottom, he's meta communicating about that he's not trying to be pushy. He really just wanted to offer information about the extra steps they did to try and troubleshoot the problem on station, so that it was available when the Pluto staff had time for it. Yeah. And finally, we finish off by both parts expressing appreciation towards each other. So Chris, we appreciate all the hard work on the weekend, and Allison reciprocating, and we appreciate your troubleshooting as well. Thanks, Chris. Yes, so that's an example. So in between, where you can see he's actually talking quite specifically about the steps they've done, the number of reboots they did, and specifically how they took the battery out, how they took the hard drive out and put it back in. But there are also all these other pleasantries and acts of kindness, if you will, built into this communication. So that's the first example of space-to-ground communication. And I have a different example that's, I'm going to present it in a different way to you guys as well. Yeah, so I mean, let's just get into it. This is example 2. So the context for this is that an astronaut has called the ground before the little snippet I'm going to show you in a minute, because they're having problems with a computer after having started a data collection tool. So basically, the computer started crashing after they opened this tool. They opened a piece of software on the computer. So after the initial part of that conversation is that they establish a common understanding of the problem, and then the spacecraft communicator in mission control finishes his turn with saying the following. That's what I'll show you here. He says, I've fought many wars with the data collection tools, so copy that one. And then he has this slight laughter afterwards. And so operationally, he didn't actually have to say this. I mean, there's no particular operational value from my perspective in saying that. He has the information he needs to start troubleshooting, but he adds that he's fought many wars with the data collection tools. And I think what he's doing is that he's talking about the problem in, so I've written here, a stylistically playful way. So it's a subtle creative language use. He's talking about it as a war. It's not an actual war. It's a metaphor. We understand that. And he's also talking about it as something to laugh a bit about. And what I want to show you here is that, so that's a choice. You could have expressed the same thing in different ways. If we go one way towards the more operational, the more neutral area, he could have said, it has been my experience in the past that data collection tools can cause problems. So this is familiar to me. And so this is a less playful, there's no war metaphor, there's no slight laughter. He's just expressing in a more neutral way that, okay, he recognizes the problem. Going even further out here, he could have just said nothing. He has the information he needs for his colleagues in mission control to start working the problem. But the risk here is that any possible frustration or other reaction from the astronauts would then just be left unmentioned. So that would only be content and no relational component. So on the other side of this, so that was the operational neutral side. We could also say, okay, what about if we consider talking more towards this frustration or sympathy? So instead of saying, I fought many wars with the data collection tools, so copy that one, he could have said, sorry to hear this is causing problems again. Or going even further, oh, I'm so very sorry to hear that. We've had so many problems with DCT software. That must be really frustrating for you. So the first one here, I just put, so he's expressing sympathy. I'm sorry to hear this is causing problems again. With the second one here, he's expressing, well, okay, more sympathy. It's longer, it's more forceful in a sense. And I would argue, and I'm going to show that in a second, that so that moves the conversation between potentially being more about how this can be frustrating than being about also maintaining that operational balance we had over here. So the question is then, okay, how does this actually combine operational efficiency with kindness and humor, space-to-ground communication? And what I found is that it maintains a balance. So when you're staying here in the middle, this is kind of the sweet spot for space-to-ground communication if you want to be both operational and you want to be supportive. So you're neither ignoring or overemphasizing this potential frustration. There could be, in this case, with a computer crashing. And I have a communication counterpart to this. Now we need to go back a bit because I didn't actually think I would have time. Here we go. So from a communication theory perspective, one way to explain this has to do with coherence or something called adjacency pairs. So a way that a lot of our verbal communication works is that it takes place in pairs that follow, I've put certain conventions for politeness and preference. So basic examples here, that if questions will tend to lead to answers. So if one person asks a question, that basically asks the other person to answer. I mean, we all know this. The saying that a greeting from one person requires the receiver to greet them back, or at least to account for why they did not do that. I mean, those are, so Brown and Levison describe these as politeness criteria. And the same goes for invitation, which leans itself towards acceptance from the other part. If we translate that into, again, space-to-ground communication and these cases of humor and of kindness that I found, it also shows what I was getting to before with the table. So if someone pays another person a compliment, if that compliment becomes a big enough part of the conversation, then by politeness, the other person is required to somehow acknowledge and possibly reciprocate that compliment. And the same can be said down here. We're talking about jokes or the use of humor in some way. So laughter and other forms of recognition might be required. If I'm making a joke and I'm making a big enough deal out of making a joke, Brown and Levison would argue that then you guys would be required to show, okay, ha ha ha, yes, yes, you are kind of funny, Dennis. I mean, regardless of if you really like the joke or not, if you wanted to maintain a certain level of politeness in the conversation. So of course, this will vary from context to context, but the point that I think is interesting is that if they made compliments or showed appreciation or expressed frustration or sympathy, if they do that in a too high degree, in a sense, that sort of forces the conversation to move towards talking about that and steers it away from being also operationally relevant. And I was looking for a metaphor and a way of explaining this. And what I came up with was the damned if you do and damned if you don't problem in space-to-ground communication. So if you are faced with a person, an astronaut or a flight controller that is making a joke or sharing a compliment and is making a fairly big deal out of doing so, as the person responding, you have the choice of following what I've called the polite route here or not. But metaphorically, regardless of what you do, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So I'll explain. So let's say you're given a very big and very elaborate compliment. If you do acknowledge this, you risk losing operational value because the conversation can sort of turn over into becoming about exchanging compliments and pleasantries and lose that more operational value it also has. On the other hand, if you don't acknowledge, for instance, a big compliment, you can lose relational value. So you could do that if you wanted to sort of, okay, I want to steer this conversation back to an operational area as well, but that can come at a cost of being seen as impolite, and this could have consequences for your working relationship going forward. So in that sense, once that first ball has been served in the conversation, that someone gave you a really big compliment, you're kind of stuck in the politeness theory sense. So moving towards the end here. So what does it mean? All right, if we want to balance operational content with relational support. So if all space-to-ground communication was kept rigidly as short and as specific as possible, it would risk becoming really stale and sterile form of human interaction. So that's my first point. And secondly, that these relational supportive aspects, they have the potential for creating a certain intimacy and social bonds, but they have to be subtle. So both parties have to recognize, or all parties, that it's there, but they shouldn't let it be like fully take over the focus on the conversation. And that's what I found. I showed you one example, but that's what happens in the space-to-ground communication that I studied. It's balanced all the time. So sometimes it's also just strictly operational, but when there are these elements of wit, of humor, and of kindness, it's always intertwined with the operational content that that they're working on, that the reason the conversation started in the first place.